Imagine this. It's the year 970, and the air smells of wood smoke and damp earth. Life is tough, raw, and often brutally unfair. You, a woman, are strong, capable, and perhaps even wealthy by birthright or through your tireless work. Then, a dispute arises over land, over inheritance, over something you know is rightfully yours. What happens? Do you stand tall in a court of law and fight for what's yours? Or does the system, built on layers of tradition, custom, and unspoken rules, silently work against you, stripping away your power piece by piece? Could the very structures meant to provide justice actually be designed to disadvantage you? Number 1. Control of dowry by husband. Imagine a young woman, Elara, on her wedding day in the year 970. The sun gleams off the silver clasps of her best tunic, and her heart beats with a mix of nerves and excitement. Her family, humble but proud, has worked tirelessly to gather her dowry. It's not just a collection of pretty things. It represents her family's investment in her future, her security in her new life, and a portion of their wealth that she is meant to bring into her new household. There are sturdy oxen, a handful of plump geese, bolts of good woolen cloth, and a heavy wooden chest containing a few silver coins. A fortune in these times. This dowry is meant to ensure her status, contribute to her new family's prosperity, and provide a buffer against hard times. It is, in essence, her share of her family's legacy given to her upon her marriage. But here's the stark reality that Elara and countless women like her would soon discover. Once that dowry passed into the possession of her new husband, it effectively became his to manage. While the dowry was traditionally viewed as belonging to the wife, legally and practically, the husband gained almost complete control over its administration and use. He could, and often would, use it as he saw fit for the household. This wasn't always a malicious act. It was often seen as the natural order, as the husband was the head of the household, responsible for its finances and well-being. But this seemingly innocuous arrangement opened a legal loophole that could leave a woman incredibly vulnerable in a property dispute. Consider the implications. The silver coins Elara brought her husband might use them to purchase a new plow. The oxen, he might sell them to pay a debt or invest in a new field. All of these actions, while potentially beneficial for the shared household, were entirely at his discretion. Elara had no legal standing to object, no right to demand an accounting, and certainly no power to prevent him from alienating these assets. In the eyes of the law and custom of 970, add her dowry, once transferred, merged with his property, and he held the reins. This created a precarious situation. If her husband made a series of poor financial decisions, squandering the dowry on failed ventures, or even losing it through gambling or poor management, Elara would find herself stripped of her personal wealth. She had no legal avenue to reclaim it, no right to demand compensation, and no way to hold him accountable. The dowry, which was meant to be her financial anchor, could vanish like mist in the morning sun, leaving her utterly dependent. Imagine the despair as Elara watched her husband make choices that depleted their resources, knowing that the very wealth her family had sacrificed to give her was slipping away, and she could do nothing but watch. This loophole wasn't about a specific law explicitly stating husbands may misuse dowries. Instead, it arose from the patriarchal assumptions embedded in the legal and social structures of the time. The husband's mundium or manus, his legal authority and protection over his wife, extended to all her property. He was her legal representative, her guardian, and the manager of her affairs. In exchange for his protection, he gained control. While this protection was often genuine and necessary in a dangerous world, it came at the cost of a woman's financial autonomy. If a property dispute arose later, perhaps after her husband's death, or if she sought to separate from him, the dowry assets would be a point of contention. If the original assets were gone, replaced by other items or simply consumed, it would be almost impossible for her to prove her original contribution or reclaim its value. Her claim to any property, even if it originated from her dowry, would be weak without direct male advocacy or the ability to manage her own legal affairs. This systemic control, rather than overt discrimination, quietly eroded women's property rights from the very moment they entered into marriage, leaving them vulnerable and often disempowered in the face of financial mismanagement or legal challenges. Careful planning and sacrifices made by her family, intended to secure her future, could be undone by the simple custom of the husband's absolute control, a silent disadvantage woven into the very fabric of medieval society. Number 2. Lack of independent legal standing for married women. In the bustling village of Highcross, not far from the winding river, lived a woman named Bertha. In 970, Bertha was known for her sharp mind and keen eye for good land. She had inherited a small but fertile plot from her mother, a woman who had managed to hold on to her property despite the odds. Bertha valued this land more than anything. It represented her lineage, her mother's hard work, and a crucial source of sustenance for her growing family. One day a dispute arose. A neighboring farmer, a gruff man named Eldred, began encroaching on Bertha's field, moving the boundary stones ever so slightly, claiming the land as his own based on some forgotten family custom. Bertha was furious. She knew her rights. She had witnesses, her aging aunt who remembered where the original stones lay, and a younger cousin who had helped her clear the field just last year. She wanted to march straight to the local moot, the assembly where disputes were settled, and present her case with all the passion and logic she possessed. There was a fundamental problem, a legal loophole as old as time itself in their society. Bertha, as a married woman, had no independent legal standing. This concept, often referred to by terms like mundium or manus in various Germanic legal traditions of the era, meant that a married woman was considered legally dependent on her husband. She could not initiate a lawsuit on her own behalf. She could not sign contracts, make legal agreements, or represent herself in a property dispute. Her husband was her legal guardian, her spokesperson, her representative in all matters concerning law and property. It was a paternalistic system, supposedly designed for her protection, but in reality it stripped her of her voice and agency in the legal arena. So, when Bertha discovered Eldred's encroachment, she couldn't simply walk into the moot and demand justice. She had to go to her husband, Cynric. Cynric, a kind man, was also deeply engrossed in his own farm work, and not as intimately familiar with the nuances of Bertha's inherited plot. He listened to her, nodded, and promised to look into it, but days turned into weeks. Cynric was busy, the harvest was approaching, and Eldred, meanwhile, continued to till Bertha's soil, consolidating his claim. Bertha begged Cynric to act. She provided him with all the details, the names of witnesses, the history. Cynric, perhaps intimidated by Eldred, or simply too overwhelmed with his own responsibilities, procrastinated. He might have seen the dispute as secondary to his own farm's needs, or perhaps he didn't grasp the depth of Bertha's attachment to her ancestral land. Bertha could rage, she could plead, she could gather all the evidence in the world, but without Cynric's active participation, her case remained dormant. The law did not recognize her as a separate legal entity with the right to speak for herself. This loophole meant that even if a woman possessed undeniable evidence, an ironclad claim, and the unwavering conviction of justice, her ability to pursue that justice was entirely contingent on her husband's willingness. If her husband was ill, incapacitated, uninterested, or even actively against her claim, she was utterly powerless. Her property could be seized, her rights trampled, and her future compromised, all because the legal system itself rendered her invisible, unable to stand up for herself in the very place where justice was supposedly dispensed. Imagine the frustration, the silent fury that must have simmered within women like Bertha. To know you are right, to see your inheritance slowly being chipped away, yet to be legally muted, unable to raise your voice, unable to demand what is clearly yours. This lack of independent legal standing wasn't a flaw in the system. It was a fundamental design feature, reflecting the societal belief that women needed male protection and guidance. But in practice, it meant that women's property rights were not truly their own, but rather held hostage to the will and priorities of their husbands, creating an invisible yet insurmountable barrier in any property dispute that required formal legal action. Number 3. Husband's right to alienate, joint property without wife's consent. Consider the household of Ethelred and his wife, Lyra, in 970 AD. Their marriage had been arranged years ago, uniting two families and their modest fortunes. Lyra had brought with her a significant portion of land as her dowry, a sprawling meadow bordering a small stream, perfect for grazing their sheep. This land was not just a part of her dowry, it was a cherished inheritance from her mother's side, a piece of her family's history that had been passed down through generations of women. It was understood to be their land, the couple's shared prosperity, contributing significantly to their ability to feed their family and maintain their status within the community. However, the legal customs of the time, while acknowledging the wife's dowry as part of the marital property, often granted the husband sweeping powers over its management and disposition. This was not a partnership of equals in the eyes of the law. A husband, Ethelred, as the legal head of the household and the one responsible for its financial well-being, had the right to make decisions regarding the joint property, even without Lyra's direct consent. This presented a powerful loophole, a silent threat to a woman's long-term hold on inherited or dowered land. One harsh winter, the crops failed, and a sudden plague swept through the livestock, decimating Ethelred and Lyra's herd. Faced with dire straits and mounting debts to the local lord, Ethelred made a desperate decision. Without consulting Lyra, without seeking her agreement or even informing her until after the fact, he agreed to sell a significant portion of Lyra's cherished meadow to a neighboring farmer to settle his debts and acquire new seed for the spring planting. He saw it as a necessary evil, a swift decision to save their household from ruin. When Lyra discovered what he had done, her heart sank. The meadow, her ancestral land, the very ground her mother had walked, was gone. She confronted Ethelred, her voice trembling with a mixture of anger and despair. How could he have done this without her, without even a word? He simply shrugged, stating that it was his right as the head of the household to make such decisions for their survival. And legally, he was correct. Even though the land had originated as her dowry, even though it was meant to be their shared asset, his authority to alienate it was almost absolute. Lyra had no legal recourse. She could not appeal to the local lord to invalidate the sale. The transaction, once completed by Ethelred, was considered binding. Her lack of direct consent, while morally devastating, held no legal weight in challenging the sale. The system designed to consolidate power and decision-making in the male head of the household allowed husbands to sell, mortgage, or otherwise dispose of property, even that which had been brought into the marriage by their wives, without their wives' express permission. This loophole meant that a woman's security, her family's legacy, and her personal connection to her land could be unilaterally severed by her husband's decisions, however well-intentioned or ill-conceived they might be. It wasn't about malicious intent. It was about the fundamental legal imbalance. Imagine the profound sense of powerlessness to see your ancestral land, your very connection to your lineage, disappear from beneath your feet, not through conquest or theft, but through the perfectly legal actions of your own husband. It was a constant reminder that while women contributed significantly to a household's wealth, ultimate control and disposal of that wealth rested firmly in male hands, creating an invisible but powerful barrier to a woman's ability to protect her inherited property. Number 4. Disputed dower rights upon remarriage, or lack of male heirs. In the small, close-knit community near the old Roman road lived a woman named Gleda, In 970 AD, Gleda was a widow, her husband, Theron, having fallen ill during a harsh winter. Fortunately for Gleda, Theron had been a man of some standing, and upon his death, she was granted her dower, a portion of his lands, usually about 1/3, set aside to support her during her widowhood. This was a crucial provision, intended to prevent widows from falling into destitution. For Gleda, her dower lands, which included a small orchard and a well-kept cottage, represented her independence, her dignity, and her ability to provide for herself and her young children. It was her haven, her security, in a world that offered few guarantees for single women. However, the security of dower rights was often conditional, fraught with potential pitfalls and legal challenges that could quickly turn a woman's haven into a battleground. One significant loophole arose when a widow considered remarriage. While dower was meant to support her, it was often tied to her deceased husband's family line. If she remarried, her new husband would be expected to support her, and the original dower lands could be viewed as no longer necessary for her sustenance from the first marriage. Moreover, the family of her deceased husband often felt a proprietary claim over these lands, seeing them as temporarily loaned to the widow rather than irrevocably hers. Gleda, after 2 years of mourning, found herself drawn to a sturdy widower from a neighboring village, a good man named Orm. Their children played well together, and she longed for companionship and the stability of a new partnership. But the moment whispers of her potential remarriage reached her former husband's family, specifically Theron's younger brother Ragnar, a storm began to brew. Ragnar saw an opportunity. He immediately began challenging Gleda's right to the dower lands, arguing that if she remarried, she would no longer need them, and they should revert to him as the closest male kinsman of the deceased. Ragnar used the local moot to publicly question Gleda's management of the lands, accusing her of neglecting the orchard or of failing to maintain the cottage, as Theron would have. These were often thinly veiled attacks, designed to undermine her claim and pressure her to relinquish the dower before she even considered taking a new husband. The implied threat was clear: remarry, and you lose your land. Another equally devastating loophole was the potential challenge if a widow had no surviving male heirs from her marriage. Dower lands were intended to support her, and by extension, the heirs of her husband. If she bore no sons to her deceased husband, or if her sons died before her, the argument could be made by male relatives of her husband that the purpose of the dower, to perpetuate the family line through the land, was no longer being served. This was less about direct legal exclusion and more about the patriarchal interpretation of customary law, where land was intrinsically linked to male lineage and military service. Imagine Gleda trying to navigate these treacherous waters to secure her future and find happiness. She might have to sacrifice her economic independence. To maintain her land, she might have to endure loneliness and the constant threat of destitution if her original dower was all she had. The system, while providing a temporary lifeline, also created conditions that could easily snatch it away, binding a woman's future to the choices she made about remarriage or the cruel fate of her children, leaving her vulnerable to challenges from her deceased husband's family, who were often eager to reclaim valuable land. This meant that a woman's dower, meant to be her safeguard, often became a point of contention, leaving her in a perpetual state of insecurity, watching as powerful male relatives circled her property, waiting for the opportune moment to seize it back. Number 5. Preference for male heirs. In the prosperous region of Wessex, in 970, the venerable Lord Eadbig lay on his deathbed. He had no sons, a fact that had troubled him greatly throughout his life. His only child was a daughter, Edith, a remarkable young woman known for her intelligence, her keen understanding of land management, and her ability to command respect. Edith had, in truth, managed much of her father's estate for years. As he grew frail, she knew every tenant, every crop yield, and every boundary marker. By all accounts, she was the most capable person to inherit his vast holdings. Yet, as Eadwig's breath grew shallow, the murmurs began among his male relatives, his ambitious nephew Oswald and a distant cousin, Cynric. The law, or rather the deeply ingrained custom, overwhelmingly favored male heirs. This was not always a written law in every region, but the principle of agnatic succession, inheritance through the male line, was a powerful, unspoken rule that permeated medieval society. Land was not just wealth. It was power, military service, and the foundation of social order. It was believed that only a man could truly fulfill the duties of a lord, including leading warriors and administering justice. The loophole here was not that daughters couldn't inherit. Sometimes they did, especially in the absence of any male heirs or when it came to movable property, but the overwhelming societal and legal preference was for sons. If there were any male relatives, however distant, they often had a stronger claim to significant land holdings than a daughter, even a capable one. Daughters were more commonly given movable goods as inheritance, jewelry, household items, or a sum of money to serve as a dowry, rather than the actual land itself. As Eadwig breathed his last, the family gathered. Edith, despite her years of dedication and her undeniable competence, found herself on the defensive. Oswald, the nephew, immediately laid claim to the bulk of the estate. He argued forcefully that it was the natural order that the land needed a male hand to defend it, to lead its men to war, and to represent the family in the king's court. He invoked ancient customs, tales of ancestors, and the necessity of male strength for the sake of the realm. Edith's arguments about her experience, her knowledge of the estate, and her father's implicit wishes were met with polite nods, but little real consideration. Powerful men of the region who would ultimately weigh in on the succession were predisposed to favor a male. They saw land through the lens of military service and male governance. Handing it to a woman, even a brilliant one, was seen as an anomaly, a potential weakness that could be exploited by rivals. In the end, Edith was granted a portion of the estate, a substantial sum of movable goods, and perhaps a smaller, less strategically important parcel of land. But the vast majority of her father's holdings, the heart of his power, and Leixlid, passed to her nephew. This happened despite her father's implied wishes and her own superior qualifications. The unspoken custom, the societal expectation, acted as an invisible yet insurmountable legal barrier. This meant that even when a woman was perfectly capable, even when she was the direct child of the deceased, she was often relegated to a secondary position in inheritance disputes. Preference for male heirs was so deeply entrenched that it superseded individual merit or even familial bonds. This loophole wasn't a specific clause in the law code, but a pervasive cultural and legal understanding that ensured the vast majority of significant land and power remained in male hands, leaving women perpetually disadvantaged in the grand game of medieval inheritance. It was a silent, powerful force that shaped destinies, ensuring that even the most deserving daughters found themselves sidelined by the simple fact of their gender. Number 6. Disinheritance through male-dominated family councils. In the year 970, in a remote corner of Mercia, lived a venerable patriarch named Godric. He was old ailing and knew his time was short. Godric cherished his youngest daughter, Ealhgifu, a bright and compassionate soul who had cared for him tirelessly in his final years. He harbored a secret wish to leave her a specific fertile piece of land known as Willowbrook Meadow, a valuable asset that she, unlike her boisterous elder brothers, would truly appreciate and cultivate with care. He confided his desire to a trusted priest, asking him to remember his wishes. While written wills were rare and less binding than in later centuries, a deathbed disposition witnessed and respected often held weight. However, the legal landscape of 970 AD presented a significant hurdle for such intentions. the overwhelming power of male-dominated family councils. Upon the death of a landowner, the disposition of his property was not solely determined by his personal wishes, nor by a formal court in the modern sense. Instead, it was often decided by a gathering of the male kinsmen, the deceased sons, brothers, uncles, and sometimes even distant cousins. This council, known as a moot, or assembly, was where inheritance customs were debated, disputes settled, and the deceased's wishes interpreted, often with a heavy hand. Women, if present at all, had little to no voice in these deliberations. So when Godric finally passed, his 3 sons, sturdy men with eyes fixed on their own inheritances, convened the family council. The priest, remembering Godric's wishes, cautiously brought up the matter of Willowbrook Meadow and his desire for Ælfgifu to inherit it. The sons listened, their faces hardening. They scoffed at the idea. Land, they argued, must remain with the male line. It was too valuable, too important for the family's honor and military obligations to be entrusted to a woman. They spoke of tradition, of the need for a unified inheritance under male leadership, and perhaps even subtly hinted that Ælfgifu was too delicate for the responsibilities of land ownership. The pressure on Ælfgifu was immense. She might have had to endure subtle threats, accusations of greed, or suggestions that she was disrespecting her father's true unspoken wishes for the family's stability. The family council, eager to keep the land consolidated within the male lineage, exerted powerful social and legal pressure. Even if the deceased's wishes were clear, a strong consensus among the male kinsmen could override them. In such a scenario, Ælfgifu would have no independent recourse. She couldn't appeal to a higher court in the way we understand it today. Her only hope would be if one of her brothers or another powerful male relative chose to champion her cause, which was rare when it meant relinquishing their own potential gains. In the end, the family council declared that Willowbrook Meadow would go to Godric's eldest son, who would then be responsible for providing a small portion of movable goods or a meager sum of money to Ælfgifu as her share. Her father's heartfelt wish was effectively nullified by the collective will of the male relatives. This loophole was insidious because it wasn't a direct legal prohibition against women inheriting, but rather a structural disadvantage within the decision-making process itself. The very assembly meant to ensure orderly succession was also the mechanism through which women's claims, even those supported by a dying patriarch, could be quietly dismissed, leaving them at the mercy of patriarchal interpretations of custom and familial greed. It ensured that control of significant property remained firmly within male hands, regardless of individual merit or the true desires of the deceased. Number 7. Difficulty proving lineage or ownership without male protectors. Imagine the plight of a young woman named Isolde in 970 AD. Her family had once held a respectable amount of land in a verdant valley, passed down for generations, but tragedy had struck. Her father died prematurely. Then her 2 older brothers were lost to a sudden fever, leaving Isolde as the last direct descendant of her male line. She was unmarried and without any close male relatives, a precarious position in a society where a woman's status and security were intrinsically linked to the men in her life, her father, husband, or brothers. In this era, proof of land ownership wasn't always a neatly bound parchment. Often, it relied on oral tradition, communal memory, and the continuous presence of a male line to assert and defend claims. Charters existed, but they were not universal, could be lost, and their legal weight varied. Your identity, your legal standing, and your very connection to the land were established and reinforced by your male kinsmen. They were your advocates, your witnesses, your muscle in a world where land disputes could quickly turn violent or devolve into endless costly arguments. When a dispute arose over Isolde's ancestral land, a distant, powerful lord began to encroach, claiming the valley had always been part of his domain. Isolde found herself in an impossible situation. She knew the history of her family's claim, the old boundary markers, the stories passed down from her grandmother, but without a father or brothers to stand by her side in the moot, to swear oaths on her behalf, or to present a unified family front, her claim seemed to wither. Who would speak for her? Who would stand witness to her lineage? The community, while perhaps sympathetic, might be unwilling to openly challenge a powerful lord without the backing of a strong male family. Her voice, as a woman without male protectors, carried far less weight. If she tried to present her case, she might be seen as an anomaly, an easy target. The very idea of a woman asserting a complex land claim without male support was almost unthinkable in the legal and social context of the time. Her family's very memory was fading because there was no male heir to carry it forward and embody its legal standing. This created an insidious loophole. It wasn't that women couldn't inherit. They sometimes did, especially if they were the only surviving child. But the difficulty of defending that inheritance was immense if she lacked male protectors. A woman without a father, husband, or brothers to champion her cause was vulnerable to the aggressive claims of others. Her lack of a male advocate meant her family's historical claims, their oral traditions, and even written evidence could be easily dismissed or challenged. Imagine the agonizing helplessness. To know your history, to feel the rightful ownership of the land in your bones, yet to have no one to legally stand with you, no voice that carried authority in the assembly. Isolde might find her ancestral land slowly absorbed by the powerful lord, her rights extinguished not by a direct legal ruling against her, but by her sheer inability to effectively prosecute her case in a system that demanded male representation and male lineage. This loophole ensured that even legitimate female claims to property could be eroded and ultimately lost, simply because the societal and legal structure left women exposed and unprotected when male guardianship was absent, making them easy targets for those who sought to expand their own holdings. Number 8. Exclusion from oaths or testimony in certain legal quanks. In the small Anglo-Saxon village of Oakhaven, in 970, a contentious land dispute flared between two families. Crux of the matter involved a verbal agreement made years ago about a shared pasture, and the truth hinged on who had sworn a particular oath and who had witnessed. Alara, a respected elder in the community, had been present when the original agreement was made. Her memory was sharp, and she knew precisely what had been said, what promises exchanged, and who had laid hands on the hallowed stone to seal the oath. She held a crucial piece of the puzzle, a vital testimony that could resolve the entire conflict. However, the legal procedures of 970 eroded were heavily reliant on oaths, sworn statements, and the testimony of witnesses. And here lay a significant, deeply ingrained legal loophole. In many Germanic legal traditions of the era, the testimony or oath of a woman, especially in matters of land and property, was often considered to carry less weight than that of a man. This wasn't always a blanket ban, but it was a pervasive bias that could critically undermine a woman's ability to defend her property rights. The reasoning behind this exclusion was rooted in prevailing societal beliefs. Women were often perceived as more emotional, less rational, and therefore less reliable as witnesses in formal legal settings. Their word, it was thought, could be swayed by sentiment rather than objective truth. While they might be allowed to testify in cases relating to domestic matters or sexual offenses, their voices in serious property disputes, especially those involving the transfer or inheritance of land, were frequently marginalized or discounted entirely. So, when the moot convened in Oakhaven to hear the land dispute, Alara, despite her knowledge, found herself sidelined. The men involved presented their cases, called upon their male kinsmen to swear oaths of support, and debated the matter with fervor. Alara tried to offer her witness account, but she was gently, or perhaps not so gently, rebuffed. Her testimony was deemed insufficient or irrelevant because she was a woman. Or perhaps, if she was allowed to speak, her words were given less credence than the sworn oaths of men who might have had less direct knowledge but possessed the requisite gender for authoritative testimony. This meant that even if a woman held undeniable truths, even if she was the sole witness to a crucial event, her ability to influence the outcome of a property dispute was severely curtailed. Imagine the frustration to possess the key to justice yet be legally prevented from using it. This loophole didn't necessarily mean a woman couldn't own land, but it dramatically hampered her ability to defend it in a contested situation. If her right to property depended on proving a past transaction or on challenging a false claim, and her testimony was legally devalued, she was at an immense disadvantage. This bias in legal testimony reflected the broader societal view of women's roles. Public legal spaces, especially those involving land and power, were primarily male domains. The exclusion or devaluation of women's oaths and testimony served to reinforce male authority and control over property, ensuring that the legal narrative was shaped by male voices, leaving women vulnerable and often powerless to assert their claims effectively, no matter how righteous they might be. It was a silent, yet profound, disservice to women's access to justice, perpetuating a system where truth itself could be obscured by gender bias. Number 9. Vagueness of customary law, allowing for male-centric interpretation. In the misty hills of Northumbria in 970 AD, two families, the Grimwalds and the Aldens, had a long-standing simmering dispute over the rights to a particular stretch of woodland. The Grimwalds claimed it was communal land, accessible to all who lived nearby for foraging and timber. The Aldens, a more powerful family, argued it was their exclusive property passed down through their male line. The heart of the argument lay not a written charter or a specific royal decree, but a tangle of ancient customs, oral traditions, and local practices that stretched back further than anyone could remember. This was the very essence of law in many parts of 970, unwritten, fluid, and often open to interpretation. This vagueness of customary law was a gaping loophole that consistently disadvantaged women in property disputes. Unlike modern legal systems with codified laws and precedents, much of medieval law, especially at the local level, was based on custom, what had always been done. This reliance on unwritten tradition meant that there was immense flexibility, but also immense potential for abuse. When disputes arose, they were often settled by a local moot. An assembly of prominent male landowners' elders were the lord's representatives. These men, steeped in patriarchal values, were the interpreters of custom, and their interpretations invariably favored male interests and male authority. Consider Alina, a widow who had inherited a small portion of her husband's land, including a right to gather firewood from the disputed woodland. Her claim was based on her husband's traditional rights, which had been respected for generations. When the Aldens began to fence off the woodland, denying access, Alina sought to uphold her family's customary rights. She brought her case to the local moot, presided over by the powerful local lord, a man named Wolfstam, and attended by numerous other male landowners. Alina presented her case, explaining how her husband had always gathered wood from that land, how her family had relied on it. She spoke of her need to warm her children and cook their meals. But the Aldens, through their male representatives, countered with their own custom. They argued that true land ownership, and therefore the right to exploit it, belonged exclusively to male heads of households who could defend it in battle, not to women, especially widows who were not seen as primary land managers. They invoked abstract notions of order and proper stewardship that implicitly excluded women. Because the law was unwritten, there was no specific text Alina could point to, no clear precedent she could cite. It was all about interpretation, about whose version of custom was more convincing, more powerful, and more aligned with the prevailing male-centric worldview of the judges and decision-makers. The male elders of the moot, themselves products of a patriarchal society, naturally gravitated towards interpretations that reinforced their own positions and societal norms. They might argue that a woman's use of the woodland was merely permissive, a kindness granted by the Alden's ancestors, rather than a true right. The outcome often hinged not on explicit legal statutes, but on the social standing of the parties involved and the prevailing patriarchal assumptions of the interpreters. Elina, a lone widow, was up against a powerful, well-connected male family, whose interpretation of custom aligned perfectly with the biases of the men judging the case. Her claim based on long-standing use was dismissed as a mere privilege, while the Alden's claim, based on male inheritance, was deemed the true unwritten custom. This loophole meant that even where women had long-standing customary rights or uses of land, these could be easily challenged and overturned by male-dominated assemblies who could simply interpret the vague law in favor of male claimants. It was a silent, insidious disadvantage, where the very flexibility of the legal system meant to adapt to local conditions became a tool for reinforcing patriarchal control over property, ensuring that women's claims were often dismissed or diminished in the name of tradition and order as interpreted by men.